Let's get started again. We're going to be late. And by the way, I must apologize for, we don't have a coffee break outside because the way installation it takes too much space, so we can put the curtain on there. And well, I kind of like it actually, if I may, but it's maybe another. Yeah, because it's very much in demand, the space for art installations. And anyways, so happy to reconvene. It's my greatest pleasure to introduce Professor Simon Levine, also not in need of any introduction, and I want certainly not enumerate it. He's an ecologist, a mathematician by training, and an ecologist, professor in Princeton, Moffat Professor of Biology, and ecology in the department there. And well, you'll be hearing about the thing. Certainly, among the only distinction we'd like to mention is because we'll be celebrating tonight. In fact, it's a very recent Tyler Prize for the environment, very prestigious ones, but adds to a score of very, very prestigious recognitions for which we are very proud of you, in fact. Simon.
Thank you very much, Andrea, and thank you, Partha, for that excellent lecture. And although the format of my lecture is going to be different, hopefully there'll be themes that you'll see that are common. And the overriding theme here is that a Darwinian perspective on these sorts of things can help us to understand what's going on. So public goods problems are widespread. Partha talked about them already. Ignacio and Andrea talked about them. They're really at the heart. This is making a lot of feedback. Is that better? A widespread both in socioeconomic situations, but also in ecological contexts. This is a picture that my wife, Carol, who's here, took when we were in South Africa of a termite mound. Termite mound is a public good, and of course you're familiar with many of the public goods problems and common pool resources problems that involve how do we share better the resources we have. So these occur at all levels of biological organization. And there's been recent work, for example, and George Pacheco and I, together with David Dingley, an oncologist, have been very interested in these situations that not only are the growth of the spread of pathogens and the growth of tumors in the body a breakdown of the public goods that constitute the body's integrated functioning, but the tumor itself is a public good that depends upon contributions of the cells that make it up, and possibly there are strategies to interfere with the production of tumors by interfering with the cells that produce the public goods. So there's a little bit of work on that, but I find it a very exciting area, and George and David and I are hoping to do some work on that. What are public goods? This may be a term that's not completely familiar to ecologists or to others who are in the audience. This is Paul Samuelson, one of the greatest economists, certainly of the last century and of all time, who defined it as goods which all enjoy in common in the sense that my consumption of it doesn't affect your consumption of it. So there's no interference with each other. These are called non-rivalrous and non-excludable, but in that sense it makes them technically different from common pool resources, which are things we share, but if I take fish out of the sea, they're not available to you. So there's a great similarity, and it's not so easy to make the distinction between them, and for the purposes of this lecture, I'm just going to lump them together. If I refer to public goods, I mean public goods and common pool resources. The key issues in dealing with these that I want to talk about are, first of all, what can we learn from nature? Secondly, what's the role of discounting, which is the central theme of this meeting? What's the role of prosociality and spite, which I will try to relate to a different... Well, you're fixed it now. Different sort of discounting. And Andrea talked about collective decision-making. I want to, if I have time, finish by talking about collective phenomena at the end. So how do we learn from nature? How do we learn from situations like these leafcutter ants that are engaging in a collective action that produces a collective good? Public goods problems represent central challenges in evolutionary theory, and indeed raise the same issues of rivalry and excludability that come about in the economic marketplace. And the tragedy of the commons, a theme that's familiar to many of you, to which I'll return. Organisms produce many public goods. Information itself is a public good. So I'll talk a little bit about collective search, in which some individuals make an investment in gaining the information that others utilize. The production of termite mounds or nests is a public good. Organisms may produce things like siderophores that lock up nutrients that are available to them, but then they're locked up in a situation that others can steal them. And similarly to the fixation of nitrogen, if I'm a plant that fixes nitrogen, converting it into forms I can use, some of it will leak out, and you might be better off to be a cheater, not pay the price of fixing the nitrogen, but just steal what you can from me as one of the neighbors. I already mentioned tumors. Antibiotics provide us examples of public goods in two ways. First of all, we're used to the situation that antibiotic use is eroding the effectiveness of antibiotics, thereby eroding a, not exactly a public good, more of a common pool resource. But even in nature, the problem of plants or bacteria producing antibiotics in order to compete with their neighbors is an example by which, if I'm next to you, all I need to do is to develop, and I'll come back to this theme, is develop resistance to that antibiotic, and then I can free ride on your destroying some of my competitors. And bacteria produce extracellular polymers that help in a variety of reasons. For example, bacteria cooperate in producing biofilms, which is what keeps dentists in business, because the biofilms are aggregates of many different species, often of bacteria that form on your teeth and other places in your body. And these depend on the production of extracellular polymers that serve two purposes. First of all, they provide a matrix for growth, and secondly, they're a signal to other bacteria as to what the concentration is. And so I've been involved with some work on this together with the student Carrie Nadell and two collaborators, in fact some more than two, but two in this paper, on how does this so-called quorum sensing evolve, how does the production of these signals evolve, how does the detection of these signals evolve. And in thinking about this, one has to think about the various ways that production can occur. So in a technical sense, quorum sensing involves the production of something called slime, that's the technical biological term, which leads to biofilms. And the slime are these extracellular polymers, and some cells produce them, some cells can't make them at all. In the simulations I'm going to show you, the yellow is the polymer itself. So I'm going to look at when I say I mean we. If I say we, I usually mean they did it. And so I'm going to look at the differences between cells that produce the polymer and those that don't. What's the advantage of producing it? And if you're going to produce it, do you always produce it? Which means you're constitutive. Do you only produce it at high densities? Do you only produce it at low densities? For example, Pseudomonas aeruginosa, very prevalent bacteria, turns it on, the production of these, at high cell densities, whereas Vibrio cholera, which is the agent that's responsible for cholera, turns on the production of these polymers at low density. So they're different situations. And we looked at this, remember what we mean, through simulations and a little bit of analysis in a paper published a few years ago, in which we looked at competition between the various types. And so the nutrient is dripping in from the top of this figure, and we developed a model, a spatially explicit model, for the growth of these different strains, and in that way are able to look at the conditions under which one strain or the other, one type or the other, will win out, or when in fact you might get several types coexisting. So we can look at these problems in evolutionary framework just as you could look at the production of a public good in a socioeconomic situation in an evolutionary framework. And so work of this sort provides a partial solution to the public goods dilemma in bacterial populations. But what if we extend this up? The prototypical public good is the commons we all share. It's what motivated this meeting. It's what Andrea talked about in his introduction. It was an idea that was first introduced, perhaps, I'm sure it's first introduced in religious texts, but in a scientific setting by William Forster Lloyd about 2 centuries ago, when he talked about the commons in which individuals might all collectively graze cattle. But I put this, I took out this picture, a painting by Cuyp, to show you that there might be also multiple uses, like a fishery in this case, utilizing some of the same grounds. Well, the idea of the commons, the idea for Lloyd's paper itself was picked up by Garrett Hardin in a seminal paper he wrote more than 50 years ago called The Tragedy of the Commons, in which he suggested that the solution to the problem was mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon. And many people, but most prominently our late colleague Lynn Ostrom, picked up on this and showed how small societies can develop the norms, can develop the mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon, that makes for a better collective situation. But globally, we're eroding our public goods. If we look at renewable resources per capita, I could have taken this from any sorts of settings, they have been going down and are projected to continue going down. Why are we destroying our common goods? Well, there are 2 reasons. One is the apparent focus of this meeting, which is that we discount the future for a variety of reasons, but you heard this emphasized in Ignacio's remark, and again in Partha's remarks, it's because of uncertainty. So uncertainty will lead to discounting. But we not only discount the future, we discount the interests of others, or maybe this is our future. Those of us who spend a lot of time on airplanes dread the idea that's being promulgated that cell phones will be allowed on airplanes. If you've sat on a train next to someone who uses the phone the whole time, imagine how it would be flying across the Atlantic while the person next to you is having a good time on their cell phone. So this is another form of discounting. So it's natural to ask the question, how has evolution shaped these interactions? How has it shaped our personal and societal discount rates? Partha and I have been involved for nearly 25 years with an organization called the Bayer Institute, which it organizes small meetings at least once a year to deal with crucial questions, and we usually wrote a paper from that. One year, and I think you were there, Partha, we tried to deal with the question of what determines the discount rates. And we had a lot of experts. So it's one of the few years we didn't come up with a paper we were happy with. This problem still not understood completely as to why we discount the future as we do. But you heard a little bit from Partha about it, and I'll say a little bit more about that.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Discount future means the future utilities, not the side.
Discount the future utilities, yes, right, absolutely. How has evolution shaped our concern for others? How has evolution shaped, and when I say evolution here, I mean including cultural evolution, collective behavior and collective decision-making, and the emergence of multicellularity in the societies in which we exist. Obviously, these are big problems. I'm just going to touch on them here. So, as you've heard in all of the previous presentations, discounting is key to how individuals and society value the future. And it's the key to cooperation. And the standard discount curves would be these sorts of exponential at different rates. And Partha talked about what rates one might use, going back to Ramsey, that this has been an issue for a long time. And in fact, argument over what the discount rate should be shapes how you feel about Nick Stern's analysis of what we do about climate change, and it's all about how you discount the future. But as Partha also mentioned, there's much evidence that not only societies, but individuals tend to discount the future hyperbolically, using a much higher discount rate for the short term. And this has implications. It means, being here in Venice, it's very hard not to think about myself in this way. It means every morning I wake up and say, that was a terrific meal we had last night at restaurant X, but tonight I'm not going to over-imbibe and over-consume. But then Ignacio Musu says, I know a really wonderful restaurant that you must go to. So you go there and you figure, I'll start tomorrow. And what's going on is that in the morning, I'm using a different discount rate. I'm using a lower discount rate for the period from 7 p.m. till 10 p.m. than I do when I'm actually at that point, because now it's closer in time and I'm using the higher discount rate, and I figure, well, tomorrow I'll do something different. And it leads to some interesting paradoxes I don't have time or expertise enough to talk about, which is if I realize that in the morning, why don't I go ahead and take actions and say, no, I'm sorry, Ignacio, I'm not really feeling well and I can't go tonight, because I don't want to be confronted with those decisions. But I don't. And there are situations where people do that. So there's a conflict between which is the real me in the morning or the me in the evening. Now, there are a number of explanations, and for an evolutionary biologist, one has to think about two kinds of explanations. One is what we would call proximate explanations, which explains how it actually happens now, and the other is an ultimate explanation, which is evolutionarily can we explain why it's evolved. Well, one fact that's often invoked is that if you take a lot of different discount curves that are exponential and average them together, you get something that's hyperbolic looking. It will emphasize the higher discount rates in the short term. And so if you have conflicting objectives and you're voting yourself, and I do, of course, I like the food, but I would like to live a little longer, then I'm trading those off. And that may involve different regions of the brain. This is way outside my expertise, but there's lots of debate about that. And debate about if it does involve different regions of the brain, did they evolve as a unit to have this yin and yang, or did they evolve independently and you're just getting conflict between different kinds of decisions? And for similar reasons, and I'm not sure that Partha and I would have this same interpretation of these results, in which case he's probably right, but societies discount hyperbolically, presumably because they are in some sense averaging the individual discount curves of different individuals. Marty Weitzman talks about this, calls it gamma discounting, and basically what he says is even if individuals are discounting exponentially, collectively the discounting will be hyperbolic. Are you okay with that?
Well, yes, this is correct quotation.
Now, there's also the question of the ultimate explanations, in which Partha and I have been discussing this for a number of years, but he's actually done something about it. The oldest version, and this is similar to what Ignacio said in his remarks at the beginning, is that hyperbolic discount, in a paper by Suzu that's often quoted, Suzu says the value of a future reward should be discounted when there's a risk that the reward is not going to be realized. That seems to me actually an argument for any kind of discounting, not just hyperbolic discounting. And then Maskin and Dasgupta wrote a paper, a very influential paper, pointing out that it's the uncertainty of realization times that is especially important here and can lead to hyperbolic discounting. I also think to some extent this is just the result of bounded rationality. If I told you that I was going to give you something that you valued now or in an hour, that might make a big difference to you, especially if it was my wife and she needed a cup of coffee and I said, wait an hour, this would be a big difference to her. But if she said, I'd like a cup of coffee next year when we're here, and I said, you mean at this hour or at this time, an hour later? She said, well, I don't really care about that. She's using a different discount curve because at that distance, she can hardly distinguish between those two events. So we don't distinguish between events that are far away and the same distance apart in space or in time, in part because we haven't developed the fine-tuning to do it, but in exchange, the reason we haven't developed the fine-tuning to do it is because of uncertainty concerning what's going to happen then anyway. She doesn't really believe we're going to be here exactly a year from now, so it doesn't matter what answer she gives me. So bounded rationality, I think, plays a part in this and has evolved. We've evolved bounded rationality because the investment in being able to distinguish those events just isn't worth it because of uncertainty. The problem of discounting and of intergenerational transfer of resources, which you heard discussed earlier, actually has a long history and strong parallels in evolutionary theory in terms of the allocation of reproductive effort, in terms of the size, the number of offspring, the litter size that animals have, or plants, in terms of how much investment they make in seeds, and the trade-offs between growth and reproduction. And so I just show you the parallel to what an evolutionary biologist would typically think about. Evolutionary biologists put a lot of emphasis on something called the reproductive value or the relative reproductive value. I actually haven't seen this concept in economics, but it's obvious there. What this quantity means, and this is a standard in evolutionary theory, is my expected, or the expected future reproduction in this case, of an individual of age X, but discounting for when the offspring are produced. And I'll go through this, but the idea being, if it's a population that's growing, offspring that I have now are going to get into the process and reproduce now, and they're going to make a larger contribution to the future than if I have them 20 years from now. And so what this is the probability, L is the probability of surviving to age Y, divided by the probability of surviving to age X. So it's the conditional probability of surviving from age X to age Y, times the number of offspring that will be produced at age Y, discounting by how far in the future that is. And we integrate it from my current age out to infinity. And so this is a measure, in the simplest model, of the relative reproductive value of an individual of age X. And you can compare individuals of different ages, and this is important evolutionarily because it suggests that when you maximize this, and typically what you'll see when you plot this is something that starts low, goes up, and then dies out again, because young individuals have a high probability of dying before they reproduce, and anyway they're going to reproduce further in the future. And therefore the optimum would be, well, for humans, maybe somewhere around 16 years old, 18 years old, something of that sort, maximum reproductive value. And therefore, if you're going to select on this, the selective pressure ought to be greatest on individuals of highest reproductive value. And that's why individuals who make it to age 16 or 17 are relatively healthy and protected for long periods of time. There's a lot of infant mortality that we've had to deal with, and individuals, as they get older and develop diseases like cancer, there's not much selective pressure to deal with those because they don't affect the reproductive performance. And so that explains a lot of evolutionary paradoxes and suggests ways to deal with them. And the evolutionary discount rate that's in there accounts for effects that are analogous to the time value of money. So there's a great parallel between, again, evolution and economics. Ken Arrow and I tried to deal with some of these aspects, asking how much you should leave to future generations, a question you heard already presented this morning, by asking the questions that in the face of certain kinds of uncertainty, for example, in terms of the number of offspring, survival of offspring, how much should you invest in current consumption versus what you will leave for the future? And there's much more to be done about this, but there's a framework here, borrowed to some extent from evolutionary theory and to some extent from economic theory, that I think can unite them both. So I talked about the first two issues here. The third issue I'd like to talk about is prosociality and spite. And actually I'm going to generalize this a little bit. So the idea of prosociality is caring about, in quotes, the welfare of others. All that really matters is whether you take actions that are in the benefit of the others, whether it's because you care about them or because you care about your reputation, doesn't matter much. But the usual definition suggests a positive take on this, that you care about, you feel concern and empathy for them. As I said, I'm going to extend this concept to any actions that benefit others, even plants and microorganisms, if they engage in actions in the collective good. And spite, which is an important concept in evolutionary theory, is just the opposite of this. Trees growing next to other trees can engage in root competition or can shade each other out, even though it's costly to them in the short term because it interferes with their neighbors and therefore leaves more resources ultimately to them. And the production of allelochemics, pathogens that poison other individuals, are examples of this sort. Now, the puzzle of prosociality is obviously very similar to the puzzle of altruism, and that was something that bothered Darwin. Altruism didn't seem to fit his theories. It delayed the publication of The Origin of Species for about 20 years. Until we began, and he never quite figured it out, but J.B.S. Haldane is quoted by John Maynard Smith, his student, as having solved this problem, which made Bill Hamilton, by the way, very angry. He didn't believe that Haldane had done this. But Haldane supposedly said something to the effect that I would jump in the river for 2 brothers or 8 cousins, making the calculation. And he was a theoretician, so he never did this. And he had a sister. I don't think he had 2 brothers, and I don't know whether he had 8 cousins. So it was never put to the test. But really what he was saying is 2 brothers represent the same number of genes, of my genes, as if I survived in the future, and 8 cousins would be the same based on our genetic relatedness. And it was Hamilton who worked this out. And especially for the haplodiploid insects, the bees, the ants, the wasps, in which the males come from unfertilized eggs, and therefore, if 2 females have the same father, they share 3/4 of their gene. Higher genetic relatedness, making it easier to understand why an individual would give up her own fitness for her sister. When this first came out, Hamilton's work more than 50 years ago, E.O. Wilson, who had been puzzling over these problems for a long time, said, aha, this is the answer. Hamilton has got it. And Wilson wrote, I didn't want to believe it, but I poured through this on a train going from Boston to Washington. By the time I got there, I was convinced and tried to convince everybody else. But in recent years, Wilson has changed his tune very recently. To some extent because of the evidence of altruistic behavior in many species that are not haplodiploid, like the termites. And as the evidence began to pour in, he said, no, I was wrong. And also, Hamilton's approach involves calculation of something called inclusive fitness, which will be close to some notions I'll use later. And this is a complicated bookkeeping system. And so Wilson, together with Martin Novak and Karina Tarnitsa, published a paper about 3 or 4 years ago in Nature in which they said, we were wrong, but not as wrong as all the rest of you out there. It's not about kin selection, and it's certainly not about this inclusive fitness bookkeeping system. Go back to natural selection, we can explain the whole thing. Now, I know all 3 authors very well, and they all have different takes on this, and I won't go into that, but it remains a very controversial subject. I still believe that altruism and cooperation are facilitated by close genetic relatedness. You know what sacrifices you'll make for your children or to your relatives compared to me. I mean, compared to what you'd make for me. I'm not talking about you, Carol. But whether this is true or not, close to a genetic relationship is not essential for cooperation. And here we see cooperation. Here's an oxpecker sitting in the back, effectively, of an ox, of Cape Buffalo. That we get cooperation between individuals of different species, and certainly reciprocal altruism can also facilitate cooperation. We make agreements. We do this over and over in societies. You scratch my back, I will scratch yours. And and it doesn't, you don't have to be able to recognize individuals. Novak and May and Durrett and I, some years ago, began to look at spatially explicit models. This is a simulation Durrett and I did, where all you have to know is that some individuals are cooperators and some are not, and there's a random initial distribution, but what happens in these associations is that in areas where there happen to be a lot of cooperators, everybody does better. And so cooperation begins to spread, and it depends in an essential way upon the viscosity in the population. And so you begin to get clusters that just form. And I think we see this in societies as well. Aggregates form. When they form, there may be collective benefits. If there are collective benefits, then those begin to spread. And this can facilitate cooperation. So tightening feedback loops through local control can enhance cooperation. But it's not sufficient, and it can also foster greed and selfish behavior and spite. For example, as already mentioned, bacteria produce toxins. They produce allelochemics to which they are immune. An example is the E. coli in our body produce something called colicin, which poisons other individuals. So here's the colicin sensitive type, the wild type. And this colicin producer has produced a way to deal with it, to poison these individuals and to win out in competition. But these guys over here, what happened is Bruce Levin and Lynn Chow tried to reproduce this in a laboratory in a well-mixed setting, and what they started to discover is that bacteria are smart. And bacteria began to evolve that said, I don't have to bother producing this toxin, which is expensive to produce after all. All I have to do is to be resistant to it. And if I'm resistant to it, I can outcompete the colicin producer because I get the same advantages because these wild type have been punished, and it can't do anything to me. But the trouble is that if in head-to-head competition with the wild type, it loses out because it has no advantage over the wild type, but it's paying some penalty to carry around the resistance. So you get a non-hierarchical competition scheme, and these types will chase each other around. What they found is if they plated things out on a gel in which there was viscosity, then all three types could evolve. The colicin producers evolved. They got displaced by the cheaters, which got displaced by the wild type, and you got coexistence. And so we modeled this and showed how it could work. And then in a paper by Ben Kerr and his group, that was published in Nature a few years later, they used our model, but then did experiments and demonstrated that this actually worked. They called it rock, paper, scissors. I don't know whether all of you know the game called rock, paper, and scissors, but it's where everybody simultaneously produces a particular strategy, and the idea is that rock beats scissors. In other words, rock can crush scissors, scissors cut paper, but paper covers rock. I never quite understood why that was bad for rocks. But the idea is that you're going to understand it's a non-hierarchical competition scheme, and that's basically what's going on here. Yeah?
Can I ask a question? We began talking about reciprocal altruism, and then moved on to the model that you're working on here. I have the sense that, at least to now, the differences arise out of the nature of the strategy. The length of the sentence that describing the strategy, in the sense that, unless I misunderstood the model that you're looking at here, you have guys who are cooperatives, that's what all they do, or they are cheaters, that's all they do, versus they're cooperatives who cooperate, but withdraw cooperation next period if they have been misled by somebody or something.
Well, bacteria are smart, but they're not that smart. Although when I talked about the biofilms, I mean that's really what I was talking about, because the biofilms are using some signal about what's going on in the population, and so they cooperate, which means they produce the extracellular polymer, or they don't, depending on the situation. And obviously bacteria are not sitting around thinking, what should I do? But as far as I know, they're not. But evolution has shaped their response to signals in such a way that they operate in situations that are optimal for particular situations in which they've evolved.
But in the Nike case that you showed,
Yeah.
I was under the impression that if one doesn't, if it's not reciprocated, then he doesn't get room.
Right.
That's
Yeah, I mean, that's a much simpler. So what I did is I went from reciprocal altruism, in which in the simplest case, two of us may end up with an agreement. And you know the big literature on that, and Axelrod's work on tit for tat. And there's a big literature on what's the optimal strategy in those circumstances. And we actually, I have a paper that just got published with Reinhard Selten, actually, but the lead author is Elon Fischer, on much more complicated strategy. But that would be pairwise situations. Here, as soon as you embed that in a collective in which there are other individuals and there may be indirect benefits, then the strategies become more complicated. And that's what's going on. Reciprocal altruism is the simplest thing that you could, but with the case of the bacteria, I mean, in reciprocal altruism, you have to know, you have to be able to recognize the other individual. Here is a demonstration with this that space can substitute for that. The classic examples are the cellular slime molds, which depend on localization to some extent. You don't recognize other individuals, but because, for example, in the evolution of cooperation due to spatial segregation, so it's similar to Tom Schelling's model of gentrification. You start from a homogeneous assemblages, but the internal processes reorganize the population into clusters with certain characteristics. And so cooperators tend to be aggregated together in the simulations I showed you, because by virtue of the fact that they cooperate and happen to be there, they produce more of them, and now they're more cooperators. Thank you. Okay. So in general, in societies, contributions to public goods, and this goes back to your question, can depend upon either intrinsic prosociality, maybe we really care about others, reciprocal arrangements in context, such as you were just asking about, or the development of structures that reinforce these themes, norms and laws and taxes and incentives that reinforce these behaviors and induce collective punishment if you don't follow them. The person, one of the people most associated with experiments on this is Ernst Fehr, and Fehr conducts a number of experiments. In a typical experiment, he would have a room full of individuals of this sort, give everybody a set of resources that they could either spend on themselves or put into a public pool, or use to punish other individuals, presumably other individuals who have violated, who are being selfish, who have violated the social norm, but you can do whatever you want. And actually, Scott Barrett has developed a lot of the theory for this as well, and some of you were at another meeting earlier this week where you heard Astrid Danneberg talking about experiments of this sort. And what Fehr finds is that in the experiments, typically individuals are selfish at the beginning, but they end up getting punished. Other individuals are paying a price to punish them, but are offended enough by their behaviors that they do so, and eventually cooperation begins to increase, but so does punishment increase. So individuals will punish other individuals who deviate social norms, and the question is why, and how do we get there? And punishment itself becomes a norm, and thinking about second-order punishment is another growth area. In other words, do you punish individuals who don't punish, and is that important? Anyway, norms are important to understand social behavior. And just like with the Novak-Wilson-Tarnitsa paper, there's a question of whether cooperation is because of spatial localization or spatial localization is the result of cooperation. In fact, there's a coexistence. In other words, the group structure makes it easier to maintain norms, but the maintenance of norms makes it easier to enhance group structure, and so these two co-evolve with each other. It's not there is a chicken and egg question as to which came first, but they feed on each other. And a lot of the debate about kin selection is a debate about which came first. Is that these are related individuals who cooperate because of this inclusive fitness argument, or these individuals who cooperate like in the simulations I showed you, and therefore come to be aggregated, and therefore, if reproduction, then in there because reproduction is local, come to be more closely related. So far, aggregation and separation can arise endogenously. Schelling's models demonstrate this too, just from random interactions and movement. But once the aggregates are there, they become a pre-pattern for selection, for fitness-enhancing behaviors, for isolation mechanisms, for cooperative behaviors. And then consensus and collective decision-making can reinforce the groups. So this provides the context in which things like norms and religions and laws and other institutions can evolve. Now, for the last part of the talk, I want to ask, how has evolution shaped collective behavior and decision-making? Alessandro Tavoni, who's here in the audience, and will talk later today, and Maya Schluter and I looked at mechanisms for coordination, ostracism, and ways to impose penalties on individuals who don't follow norms in societies. I'm going to skip over the mechanism design aspect, but there's an argument here for looking at how do individuals reach agreements when there's imperfect information about what others' payoffs are. Insurance is an important part of this. In societies, insurance arrangements spread risk and create basically a public good and a common pool resource. So with Dan Rubenstein and Avinash Dixit, I looked at the evolution of the sharing of grazing grounds among herdsmen in East Africa. These are arrangements in which I need a place to graze my cattle, but if I'm having a bad year in terms of the local climatic conditions, I say to Marino, can I send my cattle over to graze on your land? And he says to me, Marino wouldn't do this because he's a nice guy, but he says, why should I do that? And I say, because next year the situations might be reversed, and then you can send your cattle over to graze on my land. So let's just assume he has no pro-sociality. It's then, let me skip over this. This is the basic framework we looked at. We're both drawing from the same distribution. We have good years, we have bad years. And when he has a good year and I have a bad year, we move M cattle from my land to his. I make an investment X in my cattle and Z in my land. My land is sort of a public good because you're going to use it. And we look for the social optimum by looking at a function of this sort. So A1 is the yield in my land, or his land actually. A2 is the yield on my land. X1 is my investment in cattle, but, I'm sorry, his investment in cattle, but we've moved M of my cattle over, and we use a Cobb-Douglas relationship. So this is the basic payoff function at the top, and here's the costs based on our investments in X and Z. So this is with Dixit and Rubenstein. The first question is, what's the social optimum, which we compute? The second question is to ask in a game theoretic framework, is this self-enforcing? And that's going to depend on the discount rate. How much he cares about the future depends upon the discount rate. If it's not self-enforcing, one can then ask the constrained optimization problem, namely, are there second best solutions? Marino says to me, I don't want all your cattle, but you could send me 10 cows. And I realize that means I can only send you 10 in a future year. So that's a so-called second best solution. So we can work all these things out. And a lot of these societies have pro-sociality. Obviously, that's going to facilitate cooperation. So I think models of this sort are actually prototypes for looking at cooperation and insurance arrangements in a much wider range of situations. This is sort of relevant to what Partho, which is why I put this in here, was talking about in the previous lecture. It's actually a framework that has some similarity to his. I'd like his because it puts things in a more general framework. But the basic approach that Dixit and I have been taking is to say you can compute everybody's individual utility. These are individuals in group G. So the population is distributed into group. This is individual I in group G. This is the payoff function, which is maybe a Cobb-Douglas function. which depends upon my investment in my cattle, and the public good, which is now not my investment, but the sum or the average or something, some function of everybody's investment in my group in the public good. Looking back at Ernst Fair's experience, how much everybody has contributed. Here's the cost function, and then we add on to this the payoffs, not the costs, the payoffs to everybody else in the group, multiplied by how much I care about them. So this is the pro-sociality. This is all just a single group. And then we embed this in a broader framework in which there's interaction between groups, and so we sum over other groups, and that's done because the public good now is the public good in all of the individual groups multiplied times some leakage function, how much benefit I get because you cleaned up the environment in your group. So we can look at a wide range of problems, I think, in this framework. But I'm going to leave this now. I just want to close up to talk about, I'm running out of time a little bit. I'm not going to talk about the evolution of pro-social behavior, but there is a literature on this. Why is it that individuals are willing to pay a price to sustain a social norm? Well, they're embedding their decisions in a broader context. If individuals violate a social norm, they're violating my sense of fairness, and so I'm willing to pay something to punishment. If I had had time to talk about the Ultimatum Game, this would have been an example of this sort of situation. Individuals embed their decisions in a broader context. They develop notions, heuristics like fairness that characterize behaviors that substitute for calculation. So it's really an example where not only historical effects are important, where bounded rationality comes in. Individuals operate in ways that are not optimal within that context because they've developed rules of thumb, norms that guide their behavior in a wide variety of situations. In order to understand that, I think we need a theory of metagames, and there's been a little work in that direction by Kevin Zollman, a student of Brian Skirm's. So the last thing I want to mention has to do with how collective decision-making evolves. How are these collective decisions made? There's a mathematical theory of voting that talks about how individuals ought to be making decisions and how we develop voting systems that are most likely to get us to the fairest outcome. But voting goes on in a wide variety of societies. My student, Andrew Berdal, who's just finishing up, has been looking at how salmon migrate upstream. And they get to particular points, they have to make a decision. They basically vote. Each one of them has some idea, they get together, they have a beer, and they said, we really ought to go this way, and they go up. They should try navigating the streets of Venice, but it'd be a little harder. But collective decision-making goes on in a wide variety of populations. On the left, you see starlings, and you may actually see one hawk in there. So these starlings are all moving and producing some collective action that presumably has arisen in order to optimize certain behaviors, in this case, to confound the predators. And humans also engage in collective movements where we follow other individuals, not so much in our movement patterns, but in our attitudes and actions and in our societies. So how do we exploit the similarities between them? How do social norms become established? What's the role of leadership? How is consensus achieved? What's the role of the unopinionated? Ian Cousin, a former postdoc of mine, now colleague, together with some others and I, have written a series of papers on the role of leadership and decision-making. But what comes out of a lot of that work, which originated with work on fish, is that unopinionated or uninformed individuals are crucial to the nature of consensus. We may have situations where some individuals have opinion A, others have opinion B. Which way do we go? It turns out if all you had were those, it would be a complicated situation to get consensus. Having a large number of followers in the population can create a momentum that shifts, and a glue that shifts the population from one direction to another. So 3 years ago, we had a paper in Science, in which Ian's the first author, on which we took a variety of approaches to ask, what's the trade-off between information and following? What's the trade-off between really having strongly held opinions and those in which you're flexible? And so the idea, first of all, we looked at models of animal collective movement, motivated by studies of this sort that go on in Ian's lab. Each one of these dots represent a fish that's either been trained to a particular target, this one or this one, or a follower that does nothing but follow other individuals. Now, we know which ones, or they know which ones are which, because they've actually been trained to these targets. And now, if you let this evolve over time, and those crosses are just to indicate who the nearest neighbors are, eventually a few individuals see this target and others follow. So you can model this like an epidemic to see when everybody suddenly gets it that this is where we're going. And you can train them with different strengths to these different targets. And we've done a lot of work in modeling these situations and asking what the trade-offs are. Some of it comes from experiments, and some, like the one I showed you, and some comes from models of this sort, where individuals are moving in certain directions, are either following their own information or following neighbors. And I won't show you simulations of this, in which we look at the development of consensus. But the third set of situations that we've been looking at are models that are taken from the social sciences literature and the economics literature on human collective decision making. And so, for example, there's a model of Huopi that we have modified in which individuals interact with each other on a grid. This is a network with n nodes that's been randomized. Every individual here has 10 connections to others, but that's not crucial. And an individual changes its opinion with respect to what its neighbor's opinions are with a certain probability, and that probability is based on how similar those other individuals are to the focal individual in a nonlinear way. We also allow individuals to switch spontaneously or to change their connections. And that's the modification of this model. There's another model we looked at that's taken from Peyton Young's book, which is a model of conventions. The convention here might be that we're walking around speaking different languages, and we want to coordinate. And one of us, if you speak Italian and I speak English, one of us has got to change. And it's not going to work for me to change because my Italian's not good enough to be useful. So if you're a native speaking Italian, you'll probably change. That's a coordination game. Peyton Young was interested in currency usage too. So all of these models we looked at, and in all of these models, what we said is initially, suppose you have a minority that want to go in this, no uninformed individuals, a minority that want to go in one direction, a majority that want to go in the other direction, but the minority potentially holds their opinions much more strongly. In other words, I'm not going to switch to Italian no matter what you do because I know how useless it would be. What's the probability of ending up at the target that the majority speak? Well, what it says here is if we both hold our opinions with equal probability and there are more that want to go in one direction, more who want to speak Italian, we may end up speaking Italian. But if I am the more inflexible I am, the more likely it is that the minority opinion is going to dominate. And this comes about over and over again in all of these models and experiments that we look at. If you train individuals strongly to one target, even if they're a minority, they'll be able to take the unopinionated individuals they're even going to be able to convince the opinionated individuals. But if we add unopinionated individuals, they're going to be able to drive them towards the minority target. However, the more uninformed individuals there are, the harder that is to happen. The more likely it is the majority point of view is going to dominate. That's what this curve means, until you start having a population dominated by uninformed individuals. Anyway, let me conclude now. Managing the commons is both an environmental and an evolutionary challenge. In human societies, it depends on mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon. Users self-organize to develop norms and institutions, to design sanctions, and to establish and maintain cooperation. But societies are really multicellular organisms, and they're self-organized to a large extent. Individuals become doctors or become lawyers or become economists, presumably based upon the need for them, which creates a demand for them, the shortage of them. So can we get by allowing such features to self-organize, or will we end up with societies with too many economists? And at what point do we need government policies to stimulate? What's the optimal distribution? What's the trade-off between self-organization and top-down? Adam Smith is often quoted by having said his notion of the invisible hand, by pursuing his own interests, the baker frequently promotes the interests of societies more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. But we've learned, and Adam Smith knew that the invisible hand, the self-organization, doesn't protect society. Ecological systems and socioeconomic systems alike are complex adaptive systems with top-down mechanisms like rewards and punishment that feedback and interact with bottom-up mechanisms like pro-sociality and collective action. And ultimately, we have to understand the trade-offs between them and find the balance. I think Darwinian approaches, and this is the point I've tried to get across, have a lot to tell us about social evolution, and I hope they can give us some insights into addressing these problems. Thanks.
Thank you, Simon, for this beautiful talk indeed, Partha.